I keep a birthday card my daughter Vivienne sent me, the year she turned 25. On the front, she'd written in her own handwriting. Not printed, actually handwritten. To the woman who taught me that dignity is a choice you make every single morning. I've kept it in the top drawer of my nightstand for 6 years. I take it out sometimes when I need to remember that someone sees me clearly, because for most of my life the person who was supposed to see me most clearly chose not to. My name is Ruth. I'm 53 years old. I live in a semi-detached house in Oakville, Ontario, about 40 minutes outside Toronto, and I have 2 grown children and a sister Sylvia. Wait, I need to back up, because the part of this story that matters, most didn't happen recently. It happened last spring, at my nephew's university graduation dinner, in a private room at a restaurant in downtown Hamilton, when my sister handed me a place card with my name on it, and pointed me toward a table in the corner, away from the family, next to people I had never met, while the rest of my family sat at the long table under the chandelier. And she smiled when she did it, just like she used to smile when we were girls, and she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me start the right way. My sister Yvonne is 5 years older than me. We grew up in Brampton, in a house on a quiet street where everyone knew everyone, and the winters were the long kind that make you learn how to be still. Our parents, my father Leonard and my mother Grace, were good people. I mean that genuinely. They worked hard, they were present, they tried. But Yvonne was their first, and first children in families like ours carry a particular gravity. Everything she did was the first time it had been done. Her first steps, her first report card, her first heartbreak, her first everything. By the time I came along, my parents had settled into a rhythm, and Yvonne was already the sun around which that rhythm orbited. I don't think they noticed. That's the thing I've had to make peace with over many years and several rounds of therapy. They weren't conscious of it. They didn't sit down and decide to make Yvonne the priority. They just never sat down and decided not to. Yvonne was louder than me. Not in a rude way. She just knew how to take up space in a way that felt completely natural to her. She knew when to laugh, when to make herself the center, when to perform just enough vulnerability that people leaned toward her. I was quieter, more internal. I processed things slowly and privately, which in a busy household gets mistaken for not having needs. By the time I was in middle school, I had already learned to manage my own disappointments. I didn't ask for things I suspected I wouldn't get. I made my own lunches when everyone forgot. I organized my own rides to and from activities because it was easier than asking and being told it wasn't a good time. When money got tight during my parents' rougher years, and there were rougher years, the late 90s were hard on a lot of working families in the GTA. It was my after-school programs that were quietly let go. Yvonne was in competitive swimming. That continued. I was taking art classes through the rec center. Those stopped. When I asked my mother about it, she said, "Yvonne's training schedule is critical right now. We'll get you back in classes next session." Next session never came up again. I don't tell you this to paint Yvonne as stir. She wasn't, at least not in those years. She was just a person who had learned that the world arranged itself around her, and so she let it, and nobody corrected her. That's a particular kind of damage, the kind that doesn't look like damage from the inside. We grew apart as adults. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way you lose sight of someone when they keep choosing to walk slightly ahead of you. I married a man named Conrad in my early 30s. We have 2 kids, Vivienne, who is now 31, and my son Felix, who is 28. Conrad and I divorced when the children were in high school. It was one of the harder periods of my life. And it happened at the same time. I was navigating a significant health issue that took 2 years to resolve fully. During that stretch, Yvonne called me occasionally, mostly to tell me about what was happening in her own life, occasionally to ask a surface question about mine, and then to move on before I'd finished answering. She wasn't cruel about it. She just wasn't there in the way that actually counted. I built my life regardless. I have a job I'm proud of. I work as a housing case manager for a social services organization in Oakville, the kind of work that is genuinely difficult and genuinely necessary and that I find meaning in every single day. I have friends who have known me for decades, people who call me on my actual birthday, not the day after. I have my children, who are extraordinary, and a small garden that I've coaxed into something beautiful over 11 years of patient attention. My life, in other words, is full in the ways that matter. Yvonne's son Emmett graduated from McMaster last April with a degree in engineering. He's 22, bright, funny in the dry way that engineers often are, and genuinely one of my favorite people in the family. He has always been kind to me in a specific way, the kind that tells you someone actually pays attention. When he was 14, he spent 2 weeks at my house during a renovation period at Yvonne's, and we watched old Canadian films together in the evenings, and he asked me real questions about my life, and actually waited for the answers. I love him without complication, which is more than I can say for his mother. When Emmett graduated, Yvonne announced she was planning a celebration dinner for the family. A private room at Ancora, a restaurant in downtown Hamilton, that I knew by reputation as the kind of place where you do not make a reservation casually. She had it all arranged. 40 guests, family and close friends, a set menu, a slideshow, the works. She called to invite me personally. That surprised me slightly, but I told myself it was a gesture in the right direction. I said I wouldn't miss it. Emmett texted me separately to say he was glad I was coming, and that text I believed completely. I drove in from Oakville on a Saturday evening in mid-April. The weather was that specific spring temperament that Ontario does where it keeps changing its mind. Sun, then wind, then a brief hard rain, then sun again. I wore a dress I'd bought for another occasion. Something in a deep teal that I felt genuinely good in. I arrived about 10 minutes before the time Yvonne had said, which for me is simply on time. The restaurant was beautiful. Heavy linen tablecloths, low warm lighting, the kind of understated elegance that announces itself quietly. The host walked me through to the private room in the back. I could hear the noise of the family before I could see them. The private room was arranged with a large central table, long, rectangular, set for the main party, and 2 smaller tables along the side walls for what I assumed were overflow guests or family friends on the periphery. I came in, looked for my name on a place card. Yvonne found me before I found my seat. She came over with the particular efficiency she uses when she needs to deliver news. She's decided you should simply accept. Ruth, she said. You're at table 3. She pointed toward the smaller table in the far corner. We ran a little short on space at the main table, but it's really nice over there. You'll be comfortable. There were 4 seats. I recognized none of the other names on the cards. One appeared to be a colleague of Yvonne's husband, a name I'd never heard. The other 2 were friends of Emmett's from university. People I had no connection to. Meanwhile, at the main table, I could already see my parents, my aunt and uncle from Mississauga, Yvonne's in-laws, Conrad's parents, who Yvonne had apparently maintained a relationship with through Emmett, and several cousins I grew up alongside. I looked at Yvonne. She was already half turned away. Yvonne, I said. She turned back. Was that small, settled smile. The one that said she had thought about this, had made this choice, and was entirely at peace with it. You said you ran short on space, I said. How many seats at the main table? 24. And how many people at the main table? Ruth, she said, in the voice she uses when she wants me to feel like I'm being unreasonable for asking. It's a dinner. Let's just enjoy the evening. She walked back toward the main table. I stood there at the entrance to the corner with a name card in my hand. That said Ruth in Yvonne's handwriting. At a table for people who were there as pleasant extras, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one that settled into me with very little fanfare. I was going to sit at table 3. I was going to be pleasant to the people there. I was going to eat the dinner and celebrate my nephew. And then I was going to let the evening be exactly what it was. I sat down. The 2 university friends, a young man named Zach and a young woman named Preethi, turned out to be genuinely good company. Preethi was doing her master's in environmental engineering, was funny and direct, asked me good questions about my work in housing policy. Zach was quieter but laughed easily, and had the kind of attentiveness that made you feel listened to. Yvonne's husband's colleague was a pleasant man named Roger, who mostly ate his food with polite appreciation and didn't require much from anyone, which I found restful. What I noticed from table 3 was a clear and unobstructed view of the main table. I noticed that the slideshow of Emmett's life, photos from childhood through to graduation, contained perhaps 40 images. I appeared in 3 of them. In one I was partially cut off at the edge of the frame. In one, I was looking the wrong direction. In one, a Christmas photo from 2009, I was fully visible and smiling, but it was on screen for approximately 4 seconds before advancing to the next image. I noticed that when Yvonne gave her speech, which was long and polished and genuinely moving in places, because Yvonne is talented at presentation, she thanked her husband Stuart, her parents, her in-laws, her friends, the restaurant, and the photographer she'd hired to document the evening. She said, "And we're so grateful for everyone here tonight who loves Emmett." A collective gesture toward the room. My corner received the same wave as the wall behind us. Emmett gave his own short speech after his mother's. He was nervous and sweet and completely sincere. He thanked his mom. He thanked his dad. He paused, looked directly at table 3, directly at me, and said, "And I want to thank my Aunt Ruth, specifically, for being the person who always asked me what I actually thought about things, and waited for the real answer. I wouldn't have figured out what I wanted to do with my life without those conversations." He held up his glass toward me. Several people at the main table turned to look. Yvonne did not turn to look. I raised my glass back. I felt something large move through my chest, and I kept my face still and I let it pass through. What I didn't mention to anyone that evening, what I had been holding quietly since 3 weeks before the dinner, was a conversation I'd had with my cousin Adele. Adele is on my mother's side, 2 years older than me, and she had been part of the early planning conversations for the graduation dinner, because she and Yvonne are friendly, and Adele has a gift for event logistics. She'd called me about a month before the dinner to ask me something about my dietary restrictions, which told me she was doing the coordination work. During that call, almost in passing, she said, "I just want to double check. You know you're at one of Sidelined, right? Yvonne mentioned seating you there. I assumed you'd discussed it with her." I hadn't discussed it with her. "Did she give a reason?" I asked. Adele was quiet for a moment. She said the main table was for close family and the core guest list. I wanted to make sure you knew. It felt like something you should know in advance." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about calling Yvonne and asking her directly. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about declining entirely, letting the evening happen without me, protecting myself from something I could already feel coming. And then I thought about Emmett, who had texted me 3 separate times over the past month, asking if I was definitely going to be there, who had sent a voice note the week before saying in his flat engineer's cadence, "Honestly, Aunt Ruth, it would be weird if you weren't there." Like, genuinely weird. I went. I sat at table 3. I let it be what it was. What happened next I did not engineer. My mother's older sister, my Aunt Beryl, who is 76 years old and has the energy of someone 20 years younger, and absolutely no patience for indirect communication of any kind, had been seated at the main table near the center. She is one of those people who observes everything and says exactly what she sees, with no particular anxiety about whether the timing is convenient for others. At some point during the main course, Beryl looked over at table 3, looked at me, and then looked at the arrangement of the room with the particular deliberate slowness of someone doing a calculation. Then she turned to my mother, who was seated beside her, and said something. I couldn't hear it from where I was sitting, but I watched my mother's face change, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes. A look inward, then outward, then at Yvonne. Beryl then stood up, walked the length of the room, came directly to table 3, and sat down in the empty 5th chair that no one was using. She sat across from me, put both elbows on the table, and said without lowering her voice especially, "Your sister put you here on purpose, didn't she?" "I believe so," I said. "Does your mother know?" "Mom told me to just enjoy the evening." Beryl made a sound in the back of her throat that I recognized as her response to something that has no adequate verbal equivalent. She looked around the table, nodded politely to Preeti and Zach and Roger, and then looked back at me. "What are you going to do?" "Have dinner," I said. "And then let whatever's going to happen, happen." She looked at me for a long moment. "You're smarter than I was at your age," she said. Then she went back to the main table. The photographer Yvonne had hired was a woman named Bex. She was maybe 35, efficient, moved through the room without calling attention to herself. During the speeches, she positioned herself to capture Emmett at the podium. When he gestured toward table 3 and said my name, I saw Bex turn. I saw her focus shift. I watched her make the decision to capture that moment. Emmett with his glass raised in my direction. Me with my glass raised in return. The space between us measured across the length of the room. I didn't think about that photograph again for almost a month. The dinner ended. I hugged Emmett for a long time. He said quietly into my shoulder, "I meant what I said." I told him I knew. I drove home to Oakville. I sat in my dark kitchen, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. And then I let myself feel something else. Something like the satisfaction of having stayed exactly who I am. Through something designed to make me someone smaller. In the 3 weeks after the dinner, Yvonne called me once. She wanted to know if I had enjoyed the evening. The phrasing of the question told me she was checking for damage, not asking genuinely. I said the dinner was beautiful and that Emmett's speech was the best part. She said, "Yes, he's always been sentimental." I said nothing to that. The call was short. My mother called separately to tell me she hoped there were no hard feelings. I told her I didn't have hard feelings. I had clear feelings, which were different things. She didn't entirely follow that distinction, but she didn't push it either. What I didn't know, until Adele called me about 4 weeks after the dinner, was that Bex had posted a selection of images from the graduation on her professional portfolio page. She was clearly skilled. The images were warm and well-composed and told the story of the evening effectively. Among them was the photograph from Emmett's speech. Him at the podium, glass raised toward the corner of the room, and at a small table in the far corner, clearly separated from the main gang, a woman in a teal dress raising her glass back, faces visible, the geometry of the room, who sat where, the distance between the two tables entirely legible. Bex had captioned it simply, "The people who show up for the ones who matter." Adele told me it was being shared widely. She asked if I had seen it. I hadn't. I looked at it once briefly on my laptop. I recognized the image immediately, the angle, the light. The particular expression on my face that I hadn't known was visible from across the room. It looked like someone holding on to something with great care. I closed the tab. I didn't go looking at comments. I didn't post about it. I didn't reach out to Bex. I am 53 years old and I have learned, sometimes the hard way, that getting involved in your own story once it's moving on its own is almost never useful. But Adele gave me updates over the following week, because Adele is constitutionally unable to not give updates when she has them. People who had attended the dinner were commenting. People who hadn't attended, but knew the family, were commenting. Several of Yvonne's friends, women I recognized from years of family events, asked her publicly what the seating situation had been about. Emmett's university friends, I strongly suspected Preeti and Zach, shared it in a way that added context without being inflammatory. Enough context that the picture of what had happened became fairly complete for anyone looking. Yvonne called me 11 days after Bex's post. She was not calm. She said I had spoken to the photographer. I hadn't. She said I had coordinated with Adele to create a narrative. I hadn't. She said I had been planning this from the moment I sat down at table 3, that the whole thing was designed to embarrass her during what should have been the most important celebration of her son's life. I let her finish, then I said, "Yvonne, I sat at the table you put me at. I raised a glass when your son toasted me. I drove home. I didn't talk to anyone about the seating arrangement except Aunt Beryl, when she came directly over and asked me. I didn't contact the photographer. I didn't post anything. The only thing I did was show up." Silence. "The situation you created," I said, "became visible on its own. That's not my doing. That's what happens when you make a choice that other people can see." She hung up. My father called me the next day. Leonard, who spent 40 years choosing the path of least resistance in family conflict, who has always found it easier to redirect than to face things squarely. He called, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. He asked if I would walk him through what had happened. Not the photograph, not the online piece of it, but the actual evening. I did. I told him about the call from Adele 3 weeks before the dinner, when I'd learned about the seating in advance. I told him about arriving and finding my place card at table 3. I told him about the slideshow with its 3 images of me. I told him about the speech where Yvonne thanked everyone except her only sister by name. I told him what table 3 actually looked like from the inside. The pleasant company, the full view of the main table, The particular experience of watching your family celebrate someone you love from a designated remove. I told him it wasn't the first time. I told him about the years of it, steadily and without drama, the way you tell someone a thing that is simply true and has always been true, and that you have simply been waiting for the right moment to say. When I finished, my father was quieted for a long time. I didn't know it had gone this far, he said. I know. That's not an excuse. No, I said. It isn't, he exhaled. I should have been paying closer attention. For a lot of years, it wasn't an elaborate apology. It wasn't a grand reckoning. It was a man in his late 70s, saying an honest thing that he should have said earlier, in a voice that told me he meant it. I accepted it with the straightforwardness it deserved. My mother's adjustment was slower and quieter, the way her adjustments always are. She didn't call to apologize, but she stopped calling to manage me. She stopped suggesting I reach out to Yvonne. When we spoke about the dinner at all, she spoke about it carefully, in a way that told me she had been doing thinking of her own. Sometimes that's what a shift looks like. Not a declaration, just a change in what gets said next. Yvonne and I have not spoken since the call where she accused me of engineering the evening. That door is not permanently closed. I've spent enough time working on myself to know that permanent closures with people you share a history with require more certainty than I'm willing to carry around indefinitely. But it's closed right now, and I find that I'm okay with it. More okay than I expected to be. Emmett texted me about 6 weeks after everything. He wrote, Aunt Ruth, I don't know exactly what happened between you and Mom, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I want you to know that the people who were at table 3 all said you were the best part of the evening, and I knew that before they said it. I saved that text. I keep it in the same folder where I save the things I want to remember. What I held on to from all of it was this. I didn't perform. I didn't strategize. I didn't plan a confrontation or rehearse a comeback, or spend the evening engineering a response to what was being done to me. I simply decided quietly before the dinner even began that I was going to be exactly who I am, that I was going to take up the space I was given and hold my head up inside it, that I was going to let the truth be visible without my having to carry it around and wave it at people. The truth is heavy when you're the one holding it. When you set it down, it turns out it was always going to land exactly where it was supposed to. The teal dress is still hanging in my closet. I wore it again last month to a work event, and someone told me it was a great color on me. I said thank you. I meant it when I said it. If you've ever been the person at the corner table, the one seated away from the center, the one thanked with a collective gesture toward the room, the one who had to decide in a quiet hallway what kind of person they were going to be that evening. I want you to know something. You don't have to engineer anything. You don't have to plot or perform or wait for your moment. You just have to stay exactly who you are, with your head up, in whatever space they've given you. The truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs enough room to be seen. Have you ever been deliberately pushed to the margins by someone who should have done the opposite? What did you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story felt like something you've lived in some form, you're in exactly the right place. Nova Payback is here every single day with stories that are real, that are felt, and that remind you what it looks like when dignity wins. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.